Welcome to Life Stories. What happens when love turns into control? And trust is shattered by betrayal? Rachel thought she had found the perfect partner, someone who supported her ambitions and shared her values. But behind closed doors, her marriage was far from the partnership she had envisioned. As she worked tirelessly to keep their life afloat, her husband, Eric, was planning something far more sinister. A shocking discovery would change everything and force her to make a life-altering decision. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story and uncover the truth behind Rachel's escape. Rachel had always believed in the value of hard work. It was something deeply ingrained in her, passed down through generations of her family, people who had come to this country with nothing but their determination and an unshakable will to build a better future. She had spent her entire life proving herself, first in school, then in her career, and now, she thought, in her marriage. But as she sat at her desk late one evening, exhausted from another 16-hour workday, she couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something in her life was terribly wrong. Marriage, to her, had always been a partnership, a bond between two people who supported and uplifted each other, sharing burdens equally. That was what she had imagined when she married Eric. He had been everything she thought she wanted: intelligent, well-spoken, politically aware, and at first, deeply supportive of her. When they first met at a social justice conference in Washington, D.C., she had been instantly drawn to him. There was something captivating about the way he spoke, how his voice carried conviction without aggression, how his questions during the panel were challenging but insightful. He wasn't just another man who thought he understood the world, he actually did. Rachel had been a guest panelist at the conference, representing young black professionals in the legal field, and Eric had been in the audience, listening intently, nodding at all the right moments. Afterward, he approached her, his eyes bright with admiration. "I really appreciated what you said about systemic bias in hiring," he had told her, his voice warm and thoughtful. "It's something I've been researching a lot. It's infuriating how companies still use coded language to exclude people of color." She had been flattered. He was charming, insightful, and best of all, he seemed to admire her strength. In the beginning, their relationship had been like something out of a novel. They spent hours discussing politics, racial justice, economic inequality, things that mattered. He told her he respected her ambition, that he loved how driven she was. He listened to her frustrations about being a black woman in a predominantly white industry and agreed with her anger about systemic injustices. He was, in many ways, the kind of ally so many women like her had wished for, someone who understood the struggle, who didn't just offer sympathy but real, thoughtful engagement. But now, 2 years into their marriage, Rachel was starting to wonder if any of it had been real. Eric hadn't worked in over a year. At first, she had believed his excuses. The job market was tough. Companies weren't hiring people with his qualifications. And he was looking for something meaningful, something that would allow him to make a difference. It all made sense, and she wanted to support him. She had told herself that she could handle things financially for a little while. After all, she was doing well in her career. But, a little while, had turned into months. Then a year. And now, as she stared at the bills on her desk, she realized that nothing had changed. Eric didn't just struggle to find work, he didn't look for it. Instead, he spent his days in online debates, arguing about politics on forums, ranting about how corporate America was corrupt and how the system was designed to keep people like him, intelligent, educated white men, out. Rachel had tolerated it at first. Everyone needed a hobby, she had reasoned, but slowly, she started noticing a pattern in his conversations. He wasn't just talking about injustice, he was talking about how the world was unfair to white men. It had started subtly, offhand comments about how companies were now too focused on diversity, about how affirmative action meant that truly qualified candidates were being overlooked. At first, she thought he was just frustrated. She reminded him of how hard she had worked to get where she was, of how exhausting it had been to constantly prove herself in spaces that didn't welcome her. Eric had nodded along, agreeing, sympathizing. But then, one night over dinner, he let something slip that made her pause. "You have to admit," he had said, swirling the wine in his glass. You've had it easier than a lot of white guys in my position. Rachel had frozen, mid-bite, the words sinking in like lead. What? She had asked, thinking she must have misheard him. I mean, look at you, he continued, a black woman in law? That's exactly what every firm is looking for. The perfect diversity hire. The words had felt like a slap. She had spent her whole life proving that she was more than just a token. More than just a box to be checked. And now, here was her own husband, the man who had once praised her ambition, reducing all of her accomplishments to luck. She had tried to brush it off, telling herself he was just bitter, just upset about his own career struggles. But after that, she began noticing more things. Eric didn't help around the house. He rarely cooked, barely cleaned, and when she asked him to do something, he would sigh dramatically, as if she were nagging him. I thought you wanted a real partnership, he would say whenever she asked him to contribute. What happened to not caring about outdated gender roles? It was exhausting. And yet, every time she considered bringing it up, she stopped herself. He had been so wonderful in the beginning. Maybe this was just a rough patch. Maybe things would go back to how they were. So she worked harder. She picked up extra hours. Paid every bill without complaint. And Eric? He lived comfortably on her salary, never acknowledging how much she sacrificed to keep them afloat. She had ignored it for too long. Now, as she stared at her empty bank account, her exhaustion turning into quiet anger, she realized something. This wasn't a marriage. It was servitude. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could do this. Rachel had always prided herself on her resilience. She wasn't the kind of woman who gave up easily, who ran at the first sign of trouble. She had pushed through obstacles her entire life, worked twice as hard as everyone else just to be taken seriously. And she had never once allowed herself to complain. But lately, she could feel it, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones in a way that even sleep couldn't fix. Every morning, she woke up before sunrise, dragging herself through another endless workday, only to return home to find Eric exactly where she had left him, sitting on the couch, staring at his laptop or the TV, with no signs that he had done anything productive in her absence. At first, she had tried to ignore it. She told herself that it was temporary, that he was just going through a rough patch, that he would eventually pull himself together. But the longer she observed his behavior, the harder it became to believe in that illusion. Eric didn't even pretend to look for a job anymore. In the beginning, he would at least mention applications he had sent out or interviews he was waiting to hear back from. Now, he barely talked about work at all. Whenever Rachel brought it up, he would roll his eyes and change the subject, as if she were the one being unreasonable. She noticed that his daily routine had shifted entirely into a cycle of leisure and idleness. He would wake up late, make himself a leisurely breakfast using the groceries she had bought, then spend the next few hours online. At first, she thought he was just keeping up with the news. He had always been passionate about social justice, about challenging inequality. But slowly, she started to realize that something had changed. The conversations he was having weren't about activism anymore. They were about resentment, about anger, about blame. The first time she overheard him ranting about reverse racism, she had thought she had misunderstood. She had paused in the hallway, listening as he argued with someone in an online forum, his voice rising with frustration. It's ridiculous, he was saying. These companies are so desperate to fill their diversity quotas that they don't even care about real qualifications anymore. If you're white and male, you might as well not even apply. Rachel had frozen in place, her stomach twisting. That wasn't how he used to think. She had wanted to confront him then and there. But she hesitated. Maybe he was just venting. Maybe he was frustrated. She told herself that everyone had bad days, that he was lashing out because he felt powerless. But then it happened again. And again. And again. Every time she walked past him while he was on his laptop, she caught bits and pieces of his conversations. Complaints about how white men were being erased. About how black privilege was real. About how society was bending over backward for people who didn't even work as hard. It was shocking to hear these things coming from him, the same man who had once called himself an ally. who had once prided himself on his progressive views. The worst part was how casually he said it, as if he genuinely believed he was the victim. One night, after a particularly exhausting shift at work, she finally confronted him about it. "You have to admit," he said, stretching out on the couch as he scrolled through his phone. "It's harder for white men now than it's ever been." Rachel had stared at him, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feeling something crack inside her. Eric sighed, as if he were being patient with a child. "I'm just saying, you got into law school on a diversity scholarship. If you had been a white guy with the same scores, would you have gotten in?" Her entire body went rigid. She had spent her entire life working twice as hard as everyone around her just to be taken seriously. Every promotion, every achievement, every milestone had come at the cost of sleepless nights and endless self-doubt. And now, the man she had married was dismissing all of it as a handout. She had left the conversation that night too stunned to respond. But after that, she started noticing other things. Eric didn't just refuse to work. He refused to contribute in any meaningful way. The dishes would pile up in the sink. The laundry would sit in baskets for days. The floors would remain unswept. Every time she asked him to help out, he would sigh dramatically and say, "I thought you wanted an equal partnership. Why are you trying to turn me into a housewife?" At first, she had laughed it off. But over time, it started to wear on her. She would come home from a 14-hour workday to find nothing done. No dinner waiting, no acknowledgement of how hard she was working to support them both. And yet, Eric always seemed to have money for himself. New video games, expensive coffee, monthly subscriptions to online services. When she asked him where he was getting the money, he would shrug and say something vague about side gigs. But she never saw him doing any actual work. Then there were the requests for her credit card. It started with small things. "Hey, babe, can you cover this? I'll pay you back. You don't mind, do you? You make way more than me anyway." Then it escalated. One day, he asked for $500 to invest in cryptocurrency. Another time, he wanted to buy a new laptop for his job search. She started saying no more often. And that was when he began to change. At first, he sulked. He would spend the entire day brooding, acting as if she had personally betrayed him. Then he started guilt-tripping her. "You really don't want to help your own husband? It's just money. Rachel, why are you being so selfish?" She wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that he was struggling with something internally and taking it out on her. But then, one day, he said something that made her blood run cold. She had just come home from work, exhausted as usual, when he casually mentioned that he needed money for something. She sighed, rubbing her temples, already dreading the conversation. "Eric, I can't keep giving you money," she said. "I work 2 jobs just to keep up with our expenses. You need to contribute something." His expression darkened instantly. "You want me to go out there and work like some underpaid wage slave?" he scoffed. "Like I'm just some factory worker breaking my back for nothing? That's what people do," she shot back. "People work. That's how they survive." His lip curled. "You want me to be like your ancestors? Work like a damn field hand on some plantation?" Rachel couldn't breathe for a second. The words were like a slap across the face. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a joke. But he didn't. He just looked at her, waiting for her to react, daring her to argue. And something inside her snapped. Rachel barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Eric's words over and over in her mind. "You want me to be like your ancestors? Work like a damn field hand on some plantation?" It wasn't just the words themselves that made her stomach turn. It was the ease with which he had said them. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. She had spent so much time trying to justify his behavior, convincing herself that he was just bitter, just frustrated. But this wasn't bitterness. This wasn't frustration. This was resentment. And if he could say something like that so easily, so coldly, what else was he capable of? The thought unsettled her in a way nothing else had before. She didn't know it yet. But that was the night she truly began to consider leaving. The next morning, she moved through her routine mechanically. She woke up before dawn. As always, and prepared breakfast. It was a habit, something she had done for years. Maybe it was out of love. Maybe out of duty. Or maybe, deep down, because part of her still clung to the idea that things could go back to the way they were in the beginning. But that morning, something felt different. She barely ate. She barely tasted the coffee she had brewed. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, her mind a million miles away. Eric didn't get up until late. As usual, he strolled into the kitchen, yawning, stretching like he had done something to deserve a good night's sleep. He sat down, grabbed a piece of toast, and took a bite without even acknowledging her. Rachel watched him in silence, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Then, as if remembering something, he looked up from his plate. "Hey, babe, can you give me your card?" She blinked, staring at him. "For what?" "I want to grab breakfast from that new cafe down the street," he said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I heard their pastries are insane." Rachel tightened her grip on her coffee cup. "You have breakfast right here," she said evenly. Eric scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, but I'm in the mood for something different." "Come on, it's just breakfast." She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm. "No." His chewing slowed. He glanced up at her, brow furrowing slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "What?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice steady but firm. A strange silence fell between them. Eric put down his toast and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why are you acting like this? It's just a cafe. I just think it's ridiculous that you expect me to hand you my card so you can buy breakfast when I'm the one paying for everything already." Eric exhaled through his nose. An annoyed, exaggerated sound. "Jesus, Rachel, it's not that deep. I'll pay you back." "With what?" she snapped. That shut him up for a second. She saw the flicker of something dark in his eyes. Something she had never quite been able to name before. It was the same look he had given her the night before when he made that disgusting comment about slavery. He didn't like being challenged. He pushed his chair back slightly, sitting up straighter, trying to make himself look bigger. "You make more than enough money," he said coldly. "It's not like this is a big deal. Why are you being so selfish?" The word selfish almost made her laugh. For years, she had given and given and given. She had carried every financial burden, taken on every responsibility, sacrificed her peace of mind just to make sure he was comfortable. And now, the one time she said no, she was selfish? Something inside her snapped. She opened her mouth to respond. But before she could say anything, Eric's hand shot out. In one quick motion, he grabbed his coffee mug, still half full, and threw it at her. The hot liquid splashed across her chest and face before she could react. The sharp burn made her gasp, the sting biting into her skin. The mug shattered against the floor, pieces of ceramic scattering across the tile. For a moment, there was silence. The pain registered, but it was dull compared to the shock that gripped her. Eric just sat there, breathing heavily, his jaw clenched. Her hands trembled as she reached up, wiping the scalding coffee from her face, her blouse clinging to her skin, soaked through. He didn't move. He didn't apologize. Instead, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You always have to make things difficult." Rachel stared at him. She wasn't even sure what she was feeling. Anger? Fear? Betrayal? Maybe all of it. Maybe nothing. Her hands curled into fists. Slowly, she stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. She turned toward the hallway. "Where are you going?" Eric asked, his tone almost mocking, as if he expected her to brush this off. She didn't answer. She walked straight to the bathroom and locked the door behind her. Her reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. Her dark skin glistened with coffee, a faint red mark beginning to form on her cheek where the heat had burned her. She touched it gently and winced. This was it. This was the moment she knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't stay. Not just because of the coffee. Not just because of the way he had thrown it at her so effortlessly, without hesitation, but because of how he looked at her afterward. Like she was nothing. Like he hadn't just hurt her. Like he could do it again. And next time, It might not be coffee. Next time, it might be his fist. Rachel sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom. Her back pressed against the door. Knees pulled up to her chest. The scent of burnt coffee lingered on her skin. The sting of the scalding liquid still tingling across her cheek and neck. She hadn't moved for what felt like hours. Her mind was running in circles, replaying the moment over and over. The way Eric had grabbed the mug. The way he had thrown it so easily. So effortlessly. As if it meant nothing. The way he had looked at her afterward. With no regret. No shock. Just annoyance. Like she was the problem. She pressed her fingers to her temples. Trying to steady herself. To think clearly. She needed to get out of this house. That much was obvious now. But something held her in place. Something gnawed at the back of her mind. A question she had been too afraid to ask before. How had I let it get this bad? How had she not seen the warning signs earlier? She had always prided herself on being logical. On recognizing toxic people and removing them from her life. And yet, here she was, trapped, sitting on the bathroom floor of a house she paid for. In a relationship where she was not just used, but openly despised. The weight of it all pressed down on her. Suffocating. She needed answers. Slowly, she forced herself to move. She wiped her hands over her damp blouse. Exhaling shakily as she got to her feet. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water over her face. Watching the liquid mix with the remnants of coffee as it swirled down the drain. When she looked up, her reflection stared back at her, tired. Weary. But something else, too. Determined. Eric was still in the living room. She could hear the low hum of the television. The click of his laptop keys. He had moved on. Like nothing had happened. That realization hardened something inside her. He had done this before. Just in smaller ways. The snide comments. The manipulation. The laziness disguised as helplessness. This was just the first time he had been physical about it. And it would not be the last. Her heart pounded in her ears as she made her way to the bedroom. She closed the door behind her quietly. Her movements slow, calculated. If she was going to leave, she needed to be smart about it. She couldn't afford to make any rash decisions. Not yet. Her gaze flickered toward the nightstand. Eric's phone was plugged in. Charging. The screen lit up with notifications from his group chats. She had never been the type to invade someone's privacy. But something inside her whispered that now was the time to break that rule. She moved to the bed. Sitting on the edge as she reached for his phone. She tapped the screen. Locked. Of course. She exhaled, frustration rising, until she noticed his laptop sitting open at the desk across the room. The screen wasn't locked. He had never bothered setting a password. He always said it was because he had nothing to hide. Her fingers trembled as she touched the trackpad. Opening his browser. The first thing she noticed was the sheer volume of open tabs. Dozens of them. All variations of the same thing, forums, message boards, private discussion groups. At first glance, they seemed political, filled with discussions about current events, economic instability, job markets. But as she clicked deeper, something colder, something darker revealed itself. She read through the threads, her breath growing shallower with every word. The conversations weren't just about frustration with job markets. They were about resentment, about anger, about who was to blame. And again, the same theme resurfaced. Diversity hires are ruining the job market. Black women are the most entitled group of all. White men have lost control of society. And we need to take it back. And then she saw it. A post written by Eric himself. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized his username. It was the same one he had used for years. The same one he had when they first met. And yet, this was who he had always been. She clicked on one of his longer posts. The date on it was almost a year old. It was a detailed breakdown of how to manipulate a successful black woman into taking care of you. How to make her believe she was the one being unreasonable. How to make her pay for everything while still believing she was lucky to have you. She kept scrolling. And then she saw it. He had written about her. Line after line. Nausea building in her stomach. He had bragged about it. About how easy it had been. She's so desperate to prove she's independent that she'll never admit she's being used. Rachel felt like she was going to be sick. Her hands were shaking, but she kept scrolling, clicking deeper, pulling up more and more evidence. He was part of private group chats. Hundreds of messages. Men just like him, encouraging each other to use women like her. They laughed about it. They boasted about how much they could get out of them before discarding them like trash. Her mouth was dry. She forced herself to breathe, to swallow the rising panic in her throat. This wasn't just laziness. This wasn't just entitlement. This was intentional. He had never loved her. She closed the laptop, staring blankly at the screen as her mind raced. She had spent years supporting this man. Years believing he was going through a rough patch. Years hoping he would change. But he wasn't going to change. Because he had never been struggling. He had never been looking for work. This had been his plan all along. A plan to use her. To humiliate her. To reduce her to nothing while he took everything. Her breathing was shallow. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles ached. She had to get out. But she had to be careful. Eric was still in the next room. Completely unaware that she had just uncovered the truth. If he realized what she knew. If he sensed that she was planning to leave. She had no idea how he would react. She had to think. Slowly, she reached for her phone. Keeping her movements quiet as she unlocked it. She scrolled through her contacts. Hovering over a familiar name. Danielle, her best friend. The one person who had never liked Eric. The one who had warned her again and again that something about him was off. Rachel had ignored those warnings. But she wouldn't ignore them now. She pressed the call button. Her heart hammered as the line rang. Once. Twice. Then. Rachel? Rachel opened her mouth. No sound came out. She hadn't even realized she was crying until she felt the tear slip down her cheek. Rachel, what's wrong? Danielle's voice sharpened instantly. Alert. Rachel closed her eyes. I need help. Rachel had spent years waking up with a weight on her chest. An exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. But this morning was different. For the first time in what felt like forever. She woke up without fear. Without the lingering dread of what mood Eric would be in. Without the suffocating pressure of carrying their entire life on her back while he contributed nothing. She was free. The restraining order had been granted. Expedited after the threats he sent her. Legally, he couldn't come near her now. Couldn't call her. Couldn't try to manipulate his way back into her life. And professionally? He was ruined. The article exposing him and the network of men he was part of had gone viral. His name was everywhere, tied to a scandal that laid bare the disgusting tactics they had used to target successful women. His former employers, the academic institutions he once bragged about, had cut ties with him immediately. Just like that, he had nothing. Rachel sat on the porch of the small cabin where she had taken refuge. Wrapped in a warm blanket. Watching the sunrise. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Fresh and full of possibility. She had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. But now, she had that chance. Her phone buzzed. A message from Danielle. How are you feeling? Rachel smiled, typing back, lighter than I have in years. And she meant it. For the first time, she was in control of her own story. And she was ready to start a new chapter. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for compelling life stories. And share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us bring more stories to light.